Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is David Medina, and I'm the co-founder and COO of Results for America. And we are proud to be co-hosting today's event along with our amazing partners, the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Bloomberg Philanthropies. We have a great lineup of speakers for all of you who will be sharing strategies for how cities and towns can overcome capacity constraints and make their bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act grant applications more competitive. We'll also be hearing from community leaders from small towns that have been successful in receiving federal grants from these two historic laws. I'm now very pleased to welcome Michelle Thomas, the CEO of the Thomas Consulting Group, and Jen Cecil, the Director of Data Analytics and Project Management, also at the Thomas Consulting Group, who will lead us in a presentation on grant strategies for cities and towns. Michelle and Jen, thanks for being here, and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, David. And we're really excited to be here because both Michelle and I have several years of experience in capacity-constrained communities before becoming consultants. And so hopefully you'll find some of the tips and approaches that we present today useful from the perspective of not ever having enough resources to do everything you want to for your community. Next slide, Jamie. Actually, two forward. There you go.
The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, called IJA, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the two common names for the same legislation. IJA, or BIL, is the largest investment in our nation's infrastructure since the New Deal and is the biggest climate bill to date.
And the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 is aimed at reducing the deficit and fighting inflation by investing in domestic energy production and manufacturing and reducing carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. So these are the two major funding sources that you may be trying to approach, but they have so many components. We'd like to introduce you to them a little further.
So if you look at this from a federal perspective, it really is, it looks like, appropriations, and it can feel overwhelming and unapproachable. This is why many federal agencies have dedicated efforts to increasing transparency in accessing the funds. This sense of overwhelming and abstract information is also the reason that we're here for you today. The local infrastructure hub is designed to connect cities and towns with the resources and expert advice that they need to access federal infrastructure funding to drive local progress, improve communities, and deliver results for residents. Today, we'll be walking through strategies to prepare your community to access these funds through the lens of local government. Next slide, please.
So what you see on this chart is a summary of the money, at least for IJA, put into different categories from the perspective of the types of projects that the funds are intended to support. This should be a little less intimidating, I would think, than looking at it from what federal agency the money is coming through and looking at it more from your perspective on what you hope to accomplish. These are color-coded by category, with the darker gold being transportation related, yellow being communications, gray focusing on water, and light gray focusing on resiliency. There's a lot of ways we could categorize these funds, and we'll come back to that when we discuss how to look at the projects that your community needs in the next section. But hopefully this perspective makes it a little more useful.
The first thing a community needs to do to prepare federal funding allocations is to know what you need. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so to that end, there is a list. There is a list somewhere, and we encourage you to try to find it. The list, it's usually called a capital improvement program. Some communities may be too small to run their own capital improvement program, but that typically focuses on planning and financial management to coordinate the location and timing and financing of capital improvements over a multi-year period. But the point is that knowing what you need is critical. There are other places to look, though. You see here the first image in the lower left. That's a formal version of a capital improvement plan. It's a publication. Yours might be in a formal publication, or if you're even more capacity constrained, it might just be pages within a budget book or a town ordinance. Or moving from the center with the example from a budget book over to the right, it could, even if things are tight enough where you're working, live in a spreadsheet with a city planner, or on the desktop of the city's engineer. And finding that list is the first step, because someone is looking at what needs to be fixed, and you need to be able to start from your needs instead of coming up with projects that fit a grant application. So some legwork may be involved to learn where your plans are kept. Try checking out your budget books, even if you don't have fancy publications, and don't be afraid to dig in with a city planner or an engineer or a director of public works to get a hold of that list of what you need. Next. So below is just an illustrative list. It's a made up list of what that list or what those projects may look like when you encounter them. It's like a page out of a spreadsheet. You've got a short project name and a project cost and not a lot of detail. And this kind of a list can be pretty intimidating, but you can begin to make sense of which projects could be eligible for federal funding by looking at ways to group them.
Categorizing your community's projects makes it easier to match the funding, to match the need with the funding opportunity. So to figure out which projects may be good candidates for federal funding, consider reviewing the projects and assigning them values in each of the categories. So there's a type category. It's a project discipline? Is it transportation? Is it environmental water? This will help you narrow down the agencies that may provide funding for the type of work and help you hone in on which agencies when you begin doing your research. And then there's the stage. Where is this project? Is it just a concept? Do you have designs? Have you done studies? Is construction procurement already underway? So where is each of the projects in terms of what stage is it? And then funding availability. We know for some large infrastructure projects, you might have multiple funding sources. So is the project completely unfunded? Is it partially funded? Is it fully funded? So the type of project, the stage of project, the availability of funding for the project, and then how critical is this project that this project gets done? Is it an emergency project that needs to be done right away and probably can't wait for a federal funding cycle? Is it a near-term project in 1 to 3 years? Is it a longer term? And is it a priority, or is it not a critical project? So organizing, categorizing your community's projects will help you then focus on which ones are ready to go, and which ones you should begin doing research to seek funding for. Next slide, please.
So this slide shows that same generic project list, but now I've categorized them by those criteria that Michelle just walked us through: the type, the stage, the funding availability, and criticality. And I sorted them by the values that I assigned in each category. So let's look at how this would work. The first project, and the only project that received all green values, was the high mast lighting at Benton Stadium. It's a project where there's design underway. And that means we probably have a good sense of the project scope and realistic estimates of the project cost, which can be very helpful for putting together a federal grant application. This project isn't ready for construction, so we may still have some room to tweak the scope to include key elements that, say, energy efficiency grants look for. The project is partially funded, which means there is some funding that could potentially meet a federal match requirement, which is very common on a lot of these applications. The project isn't immediately critical, so we have time to wait through a grant cycle to see if we can get it funded. But if you look at the next project, arterial road traffic signals along I-24, the next several projects are at the same stage and funding availability as the first, but they're slightly more critical, being near-term projects. So if we pursue grants for these projects, we will need to be certain that other circumstances will not cause them to become emergencies. Otherwise, they seem like good candidates until we get down to the Buckhead Stream sanitary sewer overflow stop. That's an immediate emergency. That's the first red one, about 6 lines down. We should probably not look into competitive federal programs to fund this project, but instead look at funding sources that are more immediately available and accessible, like state clean water revolving loan funds. In general, this categorization works because projects that are entirely or mostly green with no red are good potential candidates for the pursuit of competitive federal grants. Projects that are mostly yellow with no red may still be viable, but could require a bit more forethought. Projects with any red values, though, should be looked at closely on an individual basis. If you feel strongly that they align with the values of a competitive grant program, but timing, need, and funding restrictions, they may cause them not to be feasible. Next slide. So now we've taken the big dense list. We've narrowed out our categories that I color-coded red, and we've got a much more manageable list of potential projects. We can look to see which funding aligns with a grant opportunity. Next slide.
So here's the new shorter list by category. And now you can, and now you have it, by project type. So when you begin doing your research, you know what your projects are, you know which buckets they fall in. So when you go to the U.S. Department of Transportation's website, you know that these are the projects that you're looking to fund, and you've narrowed it down from your really big list, and it will help you to focus. Next. At this point, we have a good idea of what projects that you want to seek funding for and a general idea of the broad IJA and IRA priority funding categories that they fall into. So the next question is, where do you go search? Obviously, we're big fans of the funding opportunity search on the local infrastructure hub website, which is linked in the chat. Like we said, when we were looking at the funds allocated to each federal agency, there's a lot of overlap, and there can be a lot of clarity when trying to figure out whether our high mast lighting replacement at Benton Stadium energy efficiency project might be available for funding through the Department of Energy, the EPA, or even if you're in a rural community, the Department of Agriculture. So if you start at the local infrastructure hub, you don't have to know which agency may be offering the funding. You can just type in a keyword like energy efficiency or flood control and browse through the related grants. When I searched for energy efficiency, I found the EECBG block grant program and was able to use the tabs to explore eligibility information and a brief summary of the grant and the kinds of activities that it funds. I prefer searching this way rather than going to individual agency websites where the material is laid out differently and I can easily lose focus. On this site, I can navigate with the back arrow and click around on the same layout for every grant to find the information that I need. That being said, there's one more step to preparing to apply for grants, and I'm hinting at that yellow star. This step can be done before, during, or after looking at your community's needs, but it is critical to be able to apply. Next slide, please. You're muted, Jen.
Sorry. That is to make sure that you are registered and that you know your community's registration information. That means knowing your community's unique identity, a unique entity identifier, and having access to your community's grants.gov workspace. If you're unsure where to look for or request this information, You may want to go to your finance officer or to departments that you already know receive grants. Most communities are already the recipients of some federal funds from formula grants. So try asking the folks that you typically hear talking about grants or funding mechanisms like CDBG. They'll be able to help get you access to the workspace and make sure that your community is registered for a unique entity identifier. There was a transition that took place in the last 2 years on sam.gov to move from DUNS numbers to UEIs, and some communities may not have updated all of their info, and it will take a few weeks to process the sam.gov registration if it's not already completed. So we urge you to try this at the front end as opposed to after you've already developed a grant application and letting it become a roadblock at the last minute. Next.
So again, before you begin writing your grant, it's so important that you build support for your grant concept. Next slide, please. Part of that begins with knowing your community. Data about your community is essential to understanding needs and being able to define those needs and writing compelling applications. The federal government has released several tools over the past few years that you can use to document the need experienced in your community. It's not a bad idea to look at the location of potential projects to see if they're in communities classified as distressed or facing other challenges. Grant application criteria often award extra points to communities with unique vulnerabilities. So it's worth taking the time to check the various tools on the federal websites and see where your project and or community fall. Next slide, please.
The biggest challenge that the communities I've worked in and with have faced is knowing where to look for matching funds. This is just one suggestion, and we'll touch on some other partnership building in a moment. But while locally raised funds and bond funds may already align with your contemplated projects and funding sources, there may be instances where the ideal version of your project impacts several jurisdictions or would benefit a larger area. This slide shows a nationwide map of federal regional commissions. These commissions frequently receive direct appropriations that some communities don't realize are available for access. Funds from these commissions are often allowed to count as the local cost share match on federal grant applications. IIJA appropriated funds to the 5 commissions that are zoomed in on in this slide. On these maps, the darker coloring indicates communities with greater levels of distress, according to the CRS, and the communities prioritize the commissions prioritize assisting those communities. So under IJA, the Appalachian Regional Commission in pink got $1 billion. The Delta Regional Authority in gold received $143 million. The Denali Commission in Alaska got $71 million. The Northern Border Regional Commission, shown in green, received $150 million, and the Southeast Crescent in blue received $5 million, all of which have a possibility of qualifying as matching funds if you collaborate with your regional commissions. Next slide.
Building partnerships with diverse groups such as nonprofits, foundations, institutions of higher education, and other government bodies is crucial when applying for federal grants. Partnering with other municipalities, county governments, regional entities, NPOs, fosters a regional collaboration and leverages shared resources. These types of partnerships are generally looked upon very favorably by the federal government. For example, when partnering with these type of entities, consider whether your unit of government is actually best to lead in an application effort. In Jackson, Mississippi, the Department of Public Works received Safe Streets for All grant funding, not by pursuing it in isolation. Their projects were a part of a area-wide application submitted by the Central Mississippi Planning and Development District, where there's a common need among nearby communities or the infrastructure connects them. Having a regional group consolidate and package the applications to support multiple jurisdictions may be the best way to actually leverage support. Collaborative efforts strengthen grant applications by showcasing comprehensive and community-wide approaches, enhancing the likelihood of success. Also, many of these IJA grant opportunities have Justice 40 goals and initiatives that are often achieved through partnerships. Nonprofits and coalitions bring valuable insights, local expertise, and a direct connection to the needs of the community, ensuring that projects align with the actual requirements. In a lot of these competitive federal applications, the federal government wants to know that you have spoken with your constituents, that you have gone out into the community and heard from them about what their needs and their priorities are. Institutions of higher education, particularly historically Black colleges and universities, can contribute a range of experiences, capabilities, innovation, educational expertise, bolstering your project's credibility and its effectiveness. There are also great resources for program evaluation. Associations and professional groups offer a platform of knowledge exchange, best practices, and advocacy, enhancing project visibility and support. Partner organizations can also provide letters of support to your applications, attest to your commitment to community involvement, and some, like foundations, could even help you access other sources of matching funds.
And I did want to just jump in for a second here on this slide. You see the thing I labeled a bonus link. That's not saying to go partner with IUPUI necessarily. It's just a link to a set of research resources on working with philanthropy if this is your community's first time trying to engage a philanthropic institution. You can go on to the next slide, please. So once you've got your wheels turning on all the possible applications that could fund your community's needs, it's not uncommon for there to be a great deal of enthusiasm, which can backfire if it's uncoordinated. Therefore, you should consider having formal gatekeepers to determine if the grant being considered aligns with local priorities before investing the hours of effort and resource that goes into an application. This could be the mayor, or a director of finance, or a group of department heads, or any other structure that's appropriate for your local government. But it should be nimble and responsive to brief, high-level summaries of opportunities and projects under consideration, so as to not delay green-lighting the application process. Capacity-constrained communities rarely have the budget for full-time grant writing staff. In fact, most grant staff in these communities have full-time jobs with full-time responsibilities to which grant writing gets added. These labor-intensive applications may benefit from leveraging other resources. Like we mentioned previously, this could be a regional council of governments or a planning district who has more flexible budget dollars than your municipality. Especially when you have a project that's already in the design phase, having an architecture or engineering firm share information with a regional group combined with your vision for the project may result in the heavier narrative portion of the lift being lifted off your plate. And so there are organizations like SSDN, Southeast Street Sustainability Directors Network, that have funding to assist with grant application writing development in the South and Southeast. But the point of that is to look for ways to divide and conquer. We also recommend considering the cost of compliance. When estimating the cost of a project, it's rare that overhead or indirect costs associated with federal compliance requirements is something that a capacity constrained jurisdiction can fully just absorb. So when you look at the number of people who have to review a payment to certify that work was done, and that have to make sure that it's done at the cost specified in the contract, and that it was done satisfactorily, and that the work qualifies for the eligible portion of expenses for the project funding, and the funding was authorized through a budget and encumbered. There's a lot of administrative costs before an invoice ever gets paid. So if you're able to quantify those indirect costs, they can be presented as part of a non-federal cost share match, and they should be factored in as you consider the money that you'll be required to expend as a local government. One other aspect of that is that many of these programs provide reimbursement for the federal share of a project cost. So in addition to making certain you have staff available to produce drawdown requests from the federal government, some additional coordination may be necessary with finance or treasury to make sure that you can float a couple of months worth of project costs just in case there's a holdup or any disputes around reimbursements. Now, ideally, if we were all well funded, we'd start with, let's hire some grant writers, but that's rarely where we are. It's hard to get the resources to hire someone, preferably with experience, to lead this effort, but once you have some buy-in and momentum around an application, consider requesting approval for official staffing around grants. The number of grant opportunities that could be under consideration by your community between now and 2026 could be a full-time job in just about any place. Next slide.
So before you actually begin writing, we recommend that you do two things. You go to the NOFO, and once I'm sure many of you have gone through many of them, they're often structured the same. You want to make sure that you check out the eligibility section and review it against your project to make sure that your city and or your project are eligible for the NOFO. And then find the scoring rubric. The scoring rubric is really, really important to helping you organize your thoughts and content that you want to include in your application. In this example that's on the screen, you'll notice this is from the 2022 FEMA BRIC NOFO. You'll notice that up to 20 points are available for adopting the 2018 or 2021 International Building Code. So if you want those 20 points, go to your city's building official and find out which version of the building code that you're on. The city that I live in just recently over the summer adopted the 2021 building code because they were operating from 2015, and it was keeping them from being eligible for some of the infrastructure funding that they were looking for. So knowing what the evaluation criteria are and what the reviewers are going to be looking for is really important before you start writing. Next slide.
And I hate to harp on it, but God, it's so frustrating if you get all the way to the end of writing a grant and you haven't registered and find that it's just a matter of being able to click a button that that prevents you from getting all the way there. So this is just a quick reminder to make sure that your organization is properly registered and has access to the grants.gov portal. Now, whole webinars and whole semesters can be spent on grant writing techniques, and these are just the beginning, but it's always best to be direct, to write an active voice, and to pay attention to restrictions and page counts. And finally, next slide, developing an application. These are just 5 starting steps to get going. I know we're running out of time, but these NOFOs are big elephants and that makes them difficult to eat. So we recommend using a structure like what's provided in the NOFO to break it into pieces so no one's looking at an enormous writing assignment in isolation. We recommend you always read the NOFO closely. We had an application for HUD we worked on recently that specified everything from font margins to spacing, and I was really glad to have a very detail-oriented editor on our team. Use what's already out there to save yourself time. I've linked here the prior awardees from the LIH website that can give you some inspiration for what works. Keep a library of your prior responses, but be careful when recycling them because the information may no longer be current. And it's pretty embarrassing to turn in a response that cites the wrong year or even names the wrong application. If you've been successful in building partnerships, make sure you have the appropriate system registrations. If you're going to have some other organization apply, harp on them for that. To make sure that they can receive federal funds and that you've all shared your required documentation where there are things like proof of insurance or EIN numbers or 501c status. And remember also to strengthen your applications by having those partners write letters of support to include in your application, and maybe even ask them to give you some feedback on your drafts to ensure that you've really incorporated the community's perspective. And with that, David, back to you.
Well, Michelle and Jen, you've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure our participants took copious notes, and we'll bring you back in just a few minutes. But now I'd like to introduce Mike Close. He's the Transportation Policy Analyst with the U.S. Department of Transportation's Rural Opportunities to Use Transportation for Economic Success, or Routes Initiative. And Michael is with us today to share what DOT is doing to help capacity-constrained cities like all of ours with their grant applications. So thank you for joining us, Michael. You have about 8 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and good to be here. Again, my name is Mike Close. I'm with the Routes Initiative, also pronounce it Roots, totally fine. I use both pronunciations. So I'll just be talking about the Routes Initiative today. And although we're rural focused, I do want to emphasize non-rural capacity constrained communities also can find a lot to benefit from our resources and tools as well. So please stay tuned for what I'll talk about. Basically, we work in 3 main ways: engaging with rural communities, trying to understand what the problems are. So then we can work with DOT leadership to address those problems with policy solutions. And then third, work across the federal government with other agencies that also have equities in rural communities. We can work together to really maximize our impact. On the next slide, you'll just see a screenshot of our website. Encourage everyone to check that out. That QR code will bring you right to it, transportation.gov/rural. And you'll find our 2 toolkits. I'm going to go in depth on the Rural Grant Applicant Toolkit, but also touch on the Rural EV Infrastructure Toolkit for the folks here that are interested in EV charging projects. You'll find tools for a rural eligibility map. There's no one definition for rural in the federal government. There's many within the DOT and many more across all the agencies. So even if you don't think you're rural, you might be surprised that you actually are defined as rural in a grant, and you can get a benefit or consideration out of that. So always kind of keep a lookout on that map. Look quickly, you can type in your address and you'll see across many different grant programs that have a benefit or consideration for rural, whether or not you're defined as such. So really encourage you to check that out. Also have a point of contact map, easy to see who your local US DOT contacts are across the different DOT modes. Pages, webinars, subscribe to our newsletter. We just put one out today, chock full of information about new NOFOs coming out. Also, we don't limit it to DOT. We take in info from across the federal government, so it's a really great resource. On the next slide, you'll see just a quick info on that rural EV infrastructure toolkit I was talking about. We put out the original one last year, but as soon as it came out, there's just so much going on in this space, so much good feedback about new content areas that people want to learn more about, and also new funding coming online, not just from Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, but also from Inflation Reduction Act. So we got to it, we just revised it again in May. And again, you'll find all sorts of info in there. Scan the QR code to check that out, or you can find it on our website. So next, I'm going to talk about this Rural Grant Applicant Toolkit. It just came out like within a week ago. So we're going to premiere it on the upcoming DOT Navigator webinar series on December 5th. So on this toolkit, it's really meant to help rural applicants with understanding the federal grant process and all the opportunities that are available to support rural transportation. It's designed for all levels of experience. So even if you do have an understanding, more experienced folks could benefit from information on specific grant programs and find ones that they didn't know or hadn't thought about applied to their project. On the next slide, you'll see that, there we go. The original toolkit came out in 2020, in case you've heard, wait, I think I've seen this before. You did. It needed a huge overhaul, not just for bipartisan infrastructure law, but also we knew it needed to be expanded. The original one just has DOT programs, but federal government, USDA, DOE, so many federal agencies, regional commissions have grant opportunities for rural transportation. We thought it was important to put it all in one place because it's so fragmented. And then the last thing, we took what was then a static directory of grants, and we made it a live searchable database, and that's that DOT discretionary grants dashboard that I'll talk more about. On the next slide, you'll see just the contents of the toolkit. You'll see overview of federal assistance, really honing in on discretionary grants. We have a roadmap on how communities can apply and succeed. And then finally, we have that compilation of discretionary grants. I'm going to hold on for the purposes of this webinar, the maximizing award success and grants portions. So for the maximizing award success, we have an overview of different aspects of application development that you should be aware of to maximize their odds of getting an award. We already had really good tips already discussed by the presenters before me, but things like verifying eligibility, extremely important. Submit all required materials. You think that's easy. It's not, because a lot of the times there's a lot of materials. We have a detailed walkthrough of NOFO, explaining the key elements that you paid attention to. And then we also go into talking about different evaluation criteria, as well as considerations that are important to be aware of when you're developing that application. And then next, talking about those discretionary grants, we have information on grants that USDOT offers, as well as selected key grants from other agencies that are very highly relevant for rural transportation. And we have specific details that we've collected with those agencies and put in that dashboard for you to have on hand. We also are going to be releasing a PDF. So for folks that like to print out the PDF and bring it with them or share, we'll also have a PDF version that will have kind of more like evergreen general summaries of those grants, so you can have those as well. Now let's move over and we'll talk about that dashboard. You can go into it on www.transportation.gov/grant/dashboard. I'll just be providing a quick overview of this dashboard just to give you a sense of how it works. You can go back to the slides. I want to quickly just talk about, give you like an overview of the highlights. We might have lost the slide, so there we go. Next. So yeah, so this dashboard provides an interactive way to search and filter through discretionary grant opportunities for transportation based specifically on your needs. So we have over 90 grant programs across DOT and non-DOT agencies. We have the ability to search and filter through grants by criteria, such as eligible activity, applicant type, transportation type. It includes filters specially designed for rural and tribal communities, so you can quickly identify programs that could have a match waiver or a set-aside benefit available. And those set-asides are important because that means that that pool of potential applicants is smaller just for you. So those are hard to find. We put it all here in one place, an easy way to be able to filter down for those. And then finally, there's also a function that will allow you to download your results as an Excel CSV file, so you can easily share those with potential partners. Then on the next slide, you'll just see a brief snapshot of what the pages look like. The summary, status from grants.gov, open, close, eligibility, funding information, links to additional resources and contact info. I do want to emphasize that this dashboard, it's just a broad overview of discretionary funding opportunities to get you kind of give ideas and thinking about it, but they are a secondary to the materials that the original program offices provide. So if you really are going to apply for a grant, you really want to make sure you always refer to the materials from the original program offices for the most up-to-date and comprehensive information on the grant. And then next slide, just some planned improvements. This is just the first iteration we have in the works. We're going to have a integration with grants.gov Right now, it's being manually updated on a weekly basis. It's going to be closer to real time once we have an API up and running. Second, we're going to be adding more grant programs as they come online. And then third, we have more features. Really appreciate any kind of feedback. Rural@dot.gov. Please contact us. Anything we can do to make the experience better, we want to know. So then I'm going to quickly go through an example search, and then after that, we'll switch to live demo just to give you kind of a sense of what it is like trying to find a grant. So say in this example, I'm a city government looking for roadway funding opportunities for planning. You would go over to eligible applicant, you'd click on that drop down, you'd find local government, you click on that, then transportation type, I would click on roadway on that drop down. And then eligible activities, I'd go to planning. Then you'd click apply. And then on the next slide, you'll see a list of results appears. And then those all links are hyperlinks to specific grant pages. You can then click on and then find the specific information for that grant. So now we'll go to the live demo. So I can share my screen and then we'll pop this up. Okay, so here's the website. So say that again, I'm a local government and interested in roadway planning, but match is going to be a huge issue for me. I would like a grant program that has a match waiver available under certain conditions. So what do I do here? I click on any, and I'm going to switch it to yes, match waiver available. And I'd click apply. And you see it shows 9 specifically for grants that have eligibility for local governments for roadway planning projects. And so here you can see Protect Resilience Program that interested me. So I'd click there and I'd see all this information on it. Was it open or closed? What was the last known post and close dates, eligibility, and then more information that we've had circulated. And then with that, I will stop here. And again, anything, any feedback, anything else we can help with, please contact us. Transportation.gov/rural@dot.gov. Thank you.
Mike, thanks for that very substantive and efficient presentation. Great compliment to what Michelle and Jen just shared with us. So thank you, Mike. I'd now like to invite Mayor Matt Turk from Allentown, Pennsylvania, to share his city's experience applying for federal grant funds. Mayor Turk.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. And thanks to the Bloomberg team for inviting me to join today and share a little bit about my experience. I would call Allentown certainly a capacity-constrained community. We are, like many other cities around the country, doing everything we can to meet the needs of our residents with limited and sometimes seemingly dwindling resources. So it's great when we have the availability of things like this to help us out. I think Michelle and Jennifer did a phenomenal job in their presentation. I think there's a lot of the points that I would make, they made, particularly when they talked about the need for this capital improvement program. Even if you don't have that capital improvement program, having that understanding of what your city's needs truly are and aligning them with the availability of resources is important, and not looking at a list of potential grant programs and saying like, ooh, let's make that my interest all of a sudden. I think it's important that your city leadership drive a lot of that as well, and that the things that are on the improvement plan and inspire you to pursue grant funding for those things are truly within city leadership's priorities. That's one thing I would add is when you are building the partnerships that, one group that wasn't necessarily involved in the slide that I saw was your legislative body. So while you may have city leadership or administrative support for applications that you might make, I think it's always helpful to also engage with a city council or town council or whoever it is and make sure that they're also on board and supportive of your applications and understand what you're applying for, particularly if you might need to approach them for some kind of resolution supporting the effort. Obviously, the local infrastructure hub is a great place to start. That's one thing that was incredibly helpful to the city of Allentown as we built applications for things like the USDA urban forestry program. We applied for a Safe Roads and Streets for All grant. We're successful with that. Having the infrastructure hub available to us is a ton of resources there. There's specific resources for various different IIJA and IRA programs that you can dig in as the next rounds of funding become available for those. They talked about building those regional partnerships. I think that is incredibly important for a host of reasons, but one of which is just those regional partners may have additional grant writing capacity for you. So while you may not have availability of or have a person on staff who's specifically tasked with preparing grant applications, those partners may have that, and they will need your assistance, obviously, in terms of providing information or providing priorities, but leveraging their assets to complete funding applications for your community are important. And in that vein, I want to point to something that we were successful doing in Allentown. There's a huge resource that's available to you in Washington, and that is your state representative or your congressperson and your senator. With each of their staffs they may have people on their staffs that are legislative aides or policy directors who are interested in supporting your community. They are available to not just provide guidance to you on what makes a successful application, but they will go to bat for it as well. So making sure that your Washington delegation is aware of what you're working on. And I think that I might be speaking from a privileged place here in Pennsylvania, but we're lucky in that our senators and my particular congressperson is incredibly responsive and interested in what's happening in our community, but also I can speak for communities surrounding us in the region. They're incredibly responsive to them as well. I think that sometimes if you just pick up the phone and make that call, you'll see success. We were successful as well. I think there's some discussion in the chat around hiring a consultant to assist with some of these things. While you as a community may not have the resources to have a full-time grant writer on staff, there is certainly value in engaging somebody on a contract basis to do some of this work. We're lucky here in our region that we're a large enough region that there are consultants available, some of whom are familiar with our city. I think that there's certainly, I can see again from the chat that there's available capacity here that you don't have to invest in that full-time person or part-time person on staff. You can go to the consultant world and get some assistance. I think there's another really interesting resource available to you when you're looking at those prior awardees, and that's tapping into a network. Cities and communities like ours tend to try to help each other out. So if you reach out, my experience is that if you reach out to whoever was working on the application that was successful in a previous cycle, they probably aren't going to be applying for the same thing in that current cycle that you might be applying for, and are willing to share information with you. It is competitive, obviously, but I think you'll find that that folks around the country want to see other folks in their position succeed. There's a surprising amount of camaraderie here at times. And the other piece of that is not just reaching out to the prior awardees, but reaching out to the organizations themselves, whether it's, we've gotten great support from HUD and from EDA in providing technical assistance. It's one of those resources that I think is underutilized, that the various different departments have technical assistance staff available to you. And it's just a question of reaching out and making the call. They can't, they can't bless your application in any way, but they can give you good feedback on what makes a successful application. So I strongly encourage that. I think DOT has been incredibly good at that as well. So when it comes to limited capacity, it's getting creative about what's available to you. It's taking advantage of amazing things like the Infrastructure Hub and being on webinars like this, and then tapping also the people behind the scenes of the local Infrastructure Hub as well to make sure that you put together the most successful applications. I would say from my experience, the biggest piece of that was taking advantage of our Washington delegation and tapping into the expertise that they have. there. If you don't already have those relationships, the other piece that I would offer there is connect early. Make sure that you're engaged with your folks in Washington prior to the application, so they know who you are. Make sure that they know your community outside of whatever statistics that you start to put on paper. They should understand the issues that you face in your community without having to look at data itself. So get involved, make those connections early. I think that the folks here are good at helping with that as well. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Mayor Turk. And I've been trying to encourage those of you who are on the session. I see so many familiar names. I know a lot of you have been participating in our technical assistance boot camps. If you want to share what's been working for you, we'd love to make this more of a dialogue. And I'm not afraid to cold call. So raising hands probably better than getting called on. While you're forming your insights, just wanted to ask a question maybe to Michelle and Jennifer and Michael. One of the scoring criteria is on that feasibility, right? Sort of demonstrating that the project is feasible and giving confidence to the granting agency that it will actually happen if they give you the money. What are you seeing as like persuasive in that area, and how do you demonstrate that feasibility?
So
one of the ways, go ahead, Jen.
The first and really the biggest thing you've got to do is that's a form they have you fill out to demonstrate that may include it's one of the SF-24R forms on grants.gov, and it may include things, considerations like your most recent audit or any pending litigation against the city for civil rights complaints. So that's like the very basic level of, you have to be able to assure them that you're going through a single audit, that you're not in jeopardy of losing federal funds for any reason like that. But beyond that, I'm going to let Michelle kind of take it to how to really demonstrate that you've got the capacity to manage a grant.
I think past performance is always key. If your community has done similar projects in the past, on time, on or under budget, maintaining all of the requirements of the grant, effective reporting, timely reporting and compliance on the grant, and you're able to demonstrate that in your narrative, that is always helpful. I think past performance is probably the greatest demonstration of the future likelihood of success.
Great. And we have a question from Misty in St. Louis. Sometimes a grant will not require a match and will pay out at 100%. However, it's often difficult to front fund the construction and wait for reimbursement. Are you aware of any resources to help with that issue? Jen, Michelle, Mike.
I am not.
I've found that working with the directors of finance or treasury in a city is usually my best resource for that, including timing the start of construction around, say, when tax bills come in and the city has a brief month or two's worth of surplus of money to begin fronting for reimbursement until you can get the rhythm of the drawdown cycle down. I'm not saying that's a best practice, but it's a practical thing that I have seen work.
Great. And
yeah, I'll just add to that. Advance payment is possible in select grant programs. It does depend on a host of different contingencies and considerations from the federal awarding agency, but it is something that exists, but it is something that continues to be a challenge that we hear about. Yes.
Great. And we have a question from Noel Bakken, maybe to Mayor Turk. What sort of issues do you bring to congressional members in relation to federal funding initiatives? Do you talk to them about projects you have in mind, about the application process? At what point do you engage them, and what content area?
So we've met, I can think of the example of Senator Casey here in Pennsylvania. I've engaged him directly, frequently about transportation safety in our city, made sure that they understand that he and his staff are aware of the challenges that we face in the city with providing safe roads for pedestrians. Engaging the staff, I think, is something that as these NOFOs become available, reaching out early on to let the staff know, hey, this is something that seems to fit our priorities, reminding them of the discussions that you might have had, and then sitting alongside them as you talk through what an application might look like. They want to be supportive of good applications. They want to see dollars flow to the communities that they represent as much as you need them. So that I believe early on, being clear about what your city's priorities are. Sometimes when you're working in a city, it can feel like every single thing is a priority, but making sure that you don't all of a sudden become a renewable energy city just because there's funding available. That's an important piece of that. So being clear about your priorities, engaging the Washington representation as early as possible. Nothing should surprise them, right? Like you should, whenever you come to them and say, hey, we want to apply for this grant application or for this this funding mechanism, it shouldn't be a surprise to them. In fact, if you have a good relationship, they'll be reaching out to you in advance of you reaching out to them saying, hey, you guys seem like a fit based on conversations that we've had. Do you guys want to put an application together? That's the position that you want to find yourself in.
Great, and we have time for one last question. It has to be a speed round question, maybe a minute or so, and we'll see which of our speakers can take it on. This is from Cynthia McCoy. Many local governments are required to have a balanced budget and have no way of accounting for future revenue. As a result, they tie up funding for other projects until a grant award is received. These communities see competitive grants and the new tax credits as too risky. What are your recommendations for these communities to integrate future revenue, tax credits, elective pay, competitive grants, et cetera, into their budget in such a way that allows them to minimize the risk and uncertainty of federal funding? We have time for 1 minute response to that. Who'd like to take that on?
I'll throw my hat in the ring and refer you to the very useful comment that Nikki Vandevort put in the chat right after that question, which is that the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan is working to put together an internal revolving loan fund to
Oh, did we lose Jen? Are you with us, Jen? Michelle, I don't know if you could take it from there.
She froze. Yeah, she was just reading Nikki's comment that Ann Arbor is creating a revolving loan fund to help pay those expenses, and 30+% refund of the refund amount goes back into the revolving fund when the federal government issues the direct pay refund. So it's not 100%, but it is a mechanism that can help keep projects moving.
Great, thank you. Mayor Turk, Michelle, Jen, Mike, thanks for everything you shared with us today. Everyone else, thank you for participating, for all of the great links and questions and information you shared in the chat. Before we end today's session, we'd like to have you all fill out a complete and a quick Zoom poll, which will just take a minute or two. And while you're filling the poll out, here's some additional information about other resources and upcoming opportunities. So here's the poll. First, to support your efforts, we've created a guide that outlines federal technical assistance programs, offering comprehensive information for federal funding. You'll find the link is in the chat and will also be prominently displayed on our website. Second, for cities with a population of 150,000 residents or less, registration is open for our boot camps. Boot camps participants will have access to subject matter experts, office hours, individualized coaching sessions, and peer-to-peer learning. They'll also have access to our library of resources. So if you're in a city or town with 150,000 residents or less, consider applying for our boot camp. And we also have—
And David, I think we have Katie Dellinger from NLC on. Just give a quick word on those.
Great.
Thank you so much for just giving me a minute. I know we've got one more minute. I'm the project manager of the boot camps. As we said, and as the slide shows, cities under 150,000, we offer technical assistance specifically for you. So far in 1 year, we've helped almost 700 cities and over a dozen infrastructure grants. We teach cities how to write strong, competitive applications through large webinars, small group coachings, one-on-one consultations with our experts, teach you on how to find and use data for your application, how to include your community's voice, how to put together a budget, lots of other topics like that. Lots of cities who are on today's webinar have already been through our boot camps. Thank you, Allentown, who's been to multiple boot camps. Our next round starts in February. You've got the QR code there. My co-lead, Justin Edwards, is putting in the chat my email address, his email address. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. But otherwise, we'd love to have you sign up for the boot camps that start in February. You can see that list on the side of the slide of which grants we'll be focusing on then. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And we have 2 other upcoming sessions. You can find more information on our website. It's 3 o'clock. Hope you all learned something, shared something. And we're here to help. Please reach out with anything you may need. Thanks. Thank you all.